Hello, everyone. Let's start with a riddle. What do you do when you're born at the end of the world? When your back is to a wall? Your only neighbor is a giant who wants to swallow you whole, and your front yard is a terrifying, endless ocean that sailors call the Sea of Darkness. Do you surrender? Do you fade into a footnote of history? Or do you make a deal with that darkness, stare into the abyss, and sail? At the dawn of the 15th century, the kingdom of Portugal was that forgotten child at the edge of Europe, impoverished, small, and living under the constant threat of its powerful Spanish neighbor. Castile, to the east, the world of trade, of spices, silk, and gold, was locked down by the rival empires of Venice and the Ottomans. Portugal was a dead end. Yet from this desperate corner of the globe, a fire was lit that would engulf the world. This tiny nation, with a population smaller than a single modern city, would kick down the door of history, unleash the age of exploration, and build the first truly global empire. It makes no sense. It defies logic. How could the underdog, the forgotten kingdom, become the master of the seas? The official story talks of brick. The truth is far stranger, darker, and more obsessive. It's not a story about a nation. It's the story of one man's all-consuming madness. A prince who never sailed a single voyage himself, but whose mind journeyed to the most terrifying corners of the imagination. A man they call the Navigator, but who might better be remembered as the Prince of Shadows, a puppet master pulling the strings of destiny from a lonely cliff. To understand how Portugal conquered the world, we must first enter the mind of this man, Infante Dom Henrique, better known to history as Prince Henry the Navigator. Forget the portraits of a noble, forward-thinking scholar. We need to travel to a windswept, desolate promontory at the southwestern tip of Portugal, a place the Romans called Promontorium Sacrum, a place of raw elemental power where the land abruptly ends and the full, terrifying might of the Atlantic Ocean begins. This is Sagres, and it was here in a remote fortress that Prince Henry created his laboratory of exploration. This was no bustling royal court. It was a place of isolation, of secrets. It was less a school and more a cult, dedicated to us. Henry was the third son of the king, a prince with no chance of inheriting the throne. In the brutal chess game of medieval royalty, a third son is either a pawn or a threat. He must find his own path to power, his own kingdom to rule. And Henry, a man of fierce piety and even fiercer ambition, looked at the land and saw it was all claimed. But then he turned his gaze west, to the endless, terrifying, the ocean that everyone else saw as a barrier, a monster Henry saw as a highway, a secret path to a destiny no one else could even imagine. What drove him? What was the fuel for this 40-year obsession? The church said it was to find the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John, a lost bastion of the faith rumored to exist somewhere in the heart of Africa or Asia. Finding this king would mean a grand alliance to crush them. That was the official story, the one for the Pope and the royal court. The merchants whispered of another motive. Gold whispers from across the Sahara told of West African empires, so rich their kings played with solid gold nuggets the size of gourds. Breaking the Muslim caravan monopoly on this river of gold would make Portugal the richest nation in Christendom overnight. But there may have been a third reason, a darker one, a secret that Henry kept locked away in his fortress at Sagres. He had surrounded himself not just with sailors and cartographers, but with mystics, astronomers, and keepers of forbidden knowledge. He was a Grand Master of the Order of Christ, the successors to the Knights Templar, an organization rumored to possess secret maps and charts pointing to lands beyond the known world. Or was it for something else entirely? A hidden knowledge, a secret power that lay waiting in the unknown lands beyond the horizon. He was a man possessed, and from his lonely perch at Sagres, he began to wage his private war against the ocean. He didn't command from a flagship on the waves, but from a desk littered with maps, star charts, and sailors' terrified reports. He was the architect, the planner, the unblinking eye that sent men to their deaths, again and again in pursuit of his singular vision. His first target was not a distant continent. It was a single point on the map just a few hundred miles down the African coast, a place that had become a wall in the European mind, a psychological barrier more formidable than any fortress. They called it Cape Bojador. But to the sailors of the 15th century, it was the end of the world. For generations, ships had tried to pass it, and none had returned. Legends passed down in hushed whispers in taverns from Lisbon to Genoa painted a terrifying picture. They said that beyond Bojador, the sea boiled, that the sun was so close to the earth it would burn a man's skin black, that the water was filled with monsters, giant serpents. The currents, they said, ran in a one-way river from which no ship could ever return. It was a place where the laws of God and nature ceased to exist. It was quite simply where the map ended. Prince Henry, from his remote fortress, saw this fear as the first great enemy. It wasn't about the wind or the waves, it was about conquering the terror in the minds of his own men. For 15 years, he sent expeditions. One after another, his captains would sail down the coast, see the reddish mists rising from the desert sands, feel the strange, powerful currents begin to pull at their hulls, and their courage would break. They would see the skeletal remains of whales on the beaches, mistake them for the bones of sea dragons, and turn back. They would return to Portugal with their tails between their legs, full of excuses. "My prince, we saw monsters in the fog. It is against God's will to go further." Each failure was a stab wound to Henry's pride and his treasury. The nobles in Lisbon mocked him. Henry the Stargazer, they called him, wasting the kingdom's money chasing ghosts and sea monsters. But Henry was relentless. You have to imagine the scene. A captain, a hardened sea dog standing before the prince, trying to explain his failure. But Henry's eyes would be cold, hard, unmoving. He wouldn't be listening to the excuses. He would be looking through the man at the horizon beyond him, and his orders would be simple, chilling. Go again. To him. These sailors were not men, they were instruments. Tools to be used, broken. The psychological toll on the port towns of the Algarve must have been immense. Every time a caravel was provisioned for a southern voyage, wives and mothers would weep on the docks, certain they were seeing their husbands and sons for the last time. These were not grand voyages of discovery. They were suicide missions ordered by a prince who seemed immune to human suffering. Then, in 1434, after 15 years of soul-crushing failure, a squire from Henry's own household, a man named Gil Eanes, was given the command. Eanes had already tried and failed the year before, his nerve breaking just like all the others. When he returned, Henry did not punish him. Instead, he summoned Eanes to his private study. We don't know what was said. The prince perhaps not with anger, but with a cold, piercing disappointment, shaming Eanes for his cowardice. He spoke not of riches or glory, but of the stain on their honor, of being defeated by a mere fantasy, a sailor's ghost story. He appealed to Eanes's pride, to his loyalty, to that deep-seated human desire to overcome the impossible. He gave him one last chance. Eanes said something that was either an act of supreme courage or sheer madness. Instead of hugging the coastline, creeping towards the dreaded Cape, he did the unthinkable. He sailed west, out into the open, unknown Atlantic, away from the shore, away from safety, into the sea of darkness itself. For days, his crew must have been on the verge of mutiny. They were sailing into nothing. But Eanes was a man transformed, driven by the ghost of his prince's ambition. After sailing on a wide arc, he turned back east. And when land was sighted, they had done it. They had sailed past the Cape of Fear. They were on the other side. They anchored in a calm bay just south of the Cape. The water wasn't boiling. There were no monsters. The sun was the same sun. To prove it, Eanes went ashore. He saw no people, only strange plants, which he gathered as proof. He had not just rounded a cape. He had shattered a psychological prison that had held Europe captive for 1,000 years. When Gil Eanes returned to Portugal, not as a failure but as a hero, everything changed. His small bouquet of unfamiliar plants was more valuable than a chest of gold. It was proof. Proof that the world was not a terrifying, finite place, but a vast, open book waiting to be read. The wall had been breached. The floodgates were about to open. And what came pouring through was a torrent of ambition, greed, and violence that would redraw the map of the world. With the fear of Bojador broken, Prince Henry's ships began to push further and further down the African coast. The age of legend was ended, and the first, most terrible commerce was in human beings. In 1441, one of Henry's captains, Feagonfialvas, captured a handful of local Berbers, a man and a woman, near the coast. He brought them back to Portugal, not as slaves, but as curiosities, a kind of human proof of his travels. But when he presented them to Prince Henry, the prince didn't see people. He saw an opportunity. The following year, the captives were returned to their homes in exchange for 10 enslaved black Africans, some gold dust, and strangely, a shield made of oxhide. The shield was a trophy, the gold was a promise. But the 10 human beings, they were the beginning of a nightmare. This was the moment the noble quest for knowledge, the crusade against the infidel, was irrevocably corrupted. In 1444, the first large-scale slave raid took place. Captain Lanfiro de Freitas, a tax collector from Lagos, led a fleet of 6 caravels. They descended on the villages of the Arguin Bay under the cover of darkness. The chronicles of the time, written by a man named Zurara, a court propagandist for Prince Henry, describe the scene with chilling detachment. He writes of the Portuguese sailors bursting into the villages, shouting, "St. George, Portugal," at once attacking them, killing and taking all they could. They captured 235 men, women, and children. The return to Lagos was a triumph. The whole town turned out to see the human cargo unloaded. Prince Henry himself was there, on horseback, taking his royal fifth, his 20%. Zurara's chronicle attempts to paint this horrific scene as an act of mercy, claiming the captives were fortunate to have their souls saved by being brought into Christendom. He describes the scene of families being torn apart on the docks, of mothers clutching their infants, of husbands separated from wives, but he frames Henry's role as that of a benevolent father, filled with pity for the souls he was saving. But this was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of royal propaganda to sanitize a brutal act of human trafficking. The prince was no savior. He was the CEO of a new and horrifically profitable enterprise. This was the dark engine that would finance the rest of the age of exploration. Every voyage south now had a dual purpose: explore a little further and snatch as many people as possible to sell in the lust for knowledge had become inseparable from the lust for bodies. The ships that sailed in the name of God and science were now slave ships. This was Portugal's original sin, the cursed treasure that would build its empire on a foundation of human misery. Prince Henry never lived to see his ultimate dream realized. He died in 1460 in his lonely fortress at Sagres, his eyes still fixed. He had pushed his captains thousands of miles down the African coast, but the grand prize, the sea route to the spices of India, remained elusive. He had laid the groundwork, built the machine, and unleashed the hunger. Now it was up to others to finish the race. For decades after Henry's death, the project seemed to stall. Other kings had other priorities: wars in North Africa, political intrigue with Spain. But the slow creep down the African coast continued, funded by the grim profits of the slave trade. Each voyage was a roll of the dice, for every ship that returned with a profitable cargo of gold, ivory, or human beings. Another was lost to storms, disease, or the uncharted, treacherous waters. The coast of Africa became a graveyard of Portuguese ships and sailors. Imagine the mindset of these sailing into a world that was literally blank on their maps. Every league south was a journey into a void. They faced scurvy, a horrific disease that made their gums rot and their teeth fall out. They faced tropical diseases for which they had no immunity. They faced hostile encounters with local populations who quickly learned to fear the white-winged ships that brought only violence. And they faced the psychological terror of being utterly, completely alone, thousands of miles from home, in a world that did not want them there. Yet they pushed on in 1488. A tough, unheralded captain named Bartholomew Dias was caught in a vicious storm off the coast of modern-day Namibia. For 13 days, his 2 small caravels were blown south. Completely out of sight of land, they were being driven by a phantom storm to the literal end of the world. They were a ghost ship, lost in a watery purgatory. When the storm finally broke, Dias turned east, expecting to find the African coastline. But there was nothing, only empty, endless ocean. In a panic, he turned north. For days they sailed, hope draining with every passing hour. They were lost, and then, on the horizon, without realizing it, the storm had done what no sailor had managed to do before. It had blown them completely around the southern tip of Africa. They had found the gateway to India. It was one of the most significant turning points in world history, and it was achieved by accident by a crew that was hopelessly lost and on the verge of mutiny. Dias wanted to push on to India. The prize was right there, within his grasp. They had been to the edge of hell and back. They refused to go a single league further. With a heavy heart, Dias was forced to turn back. On the return journey, they saw the cape they had unknowingly rounded, a massive, brooding headland pounded by ferocious waves. Dias, thinking of the terrifying storm that had carried him around it, named it the Cape of Storms. When he returned to Lisbon and told his story, no sailor would willingly sail for a Cape of Storms, so he renamed it. He called it the Cabo de Boa Esperança. The Cape of Good Hope, it was a brilliant piece of royal spin, a name that transformed a place of terror into a beacon of promise. The path was now open. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. But for Bartolomeu Dias, the man who found the key, he was overlooked for the command of the great voyage to India that he had made possible. Instead, he was given a subordinate role in a later expedition to Brazil. And in a cruel twist of fate, in the year 1500, his ship was caught in a storm. And where did it sink? In the very waters off the Cape of Good Hope. The man who had conquered the Cape of Storms was ultimately devoured by it. His ship went down with all hands, a ghost ship returning to the site of its greatest triumph, forever cursed to haunt the passage it had opened for others. The stage was now set for the final act. The King of Portugal, Manuel the Fortunate, knew this was his moment. He would not just send a few ships, he would send a statement. An armada that would blast its way to India and seize the spice trade by force. And a man of violence, of unshakable will, and brutal determination. He found that man in a minor, 30-something nobleman with a reputation for being a cold, hard, and utterly ruthless enforcer. His name was Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was not a sailor's sailor. He was a warrior, a crusader in the old mold. He saw the voyage to India not as a trading mission, but as a chance to strike a blow against Islam and enrich his king and himself in the process. In July of 1497, his fleet of 4 ships departed Lisbon. This was no exploratory jaunt. This was an invasion. Da Gama's journey was an epic of suffering. To avoid the treacherous currents of the African coast, he took a gigantic, sweeping arc through the South Atlantic, a route that kept his ships out of sight of longer than Columbus's voyage to the Americas. Imagine the psychological strain, day after day, week after week, nothing but the creak of the hull, the snap of the sails, and the vast empty dome of sea and sky. Scurvy ravaged the crew. Men died in agony, their bodies thrown unceremoniously into the sea. By the time they reached the Cape of Good Hope, da Gama's fleet was a collection of but they pressed on into the Indian Ocean, an ocean that was not empty, but was a thriving, bustling world of trade dominated by Arab and Indian merchants for centuries. Da Gama was a bull charging into a china shop. He knew nothing of the complex politics, the ancient trading customs, the delicate web of diplomacy. He had only 2 tools, his cannons and his arrow. When he arrived on the East African coast, in places like Mozambique and Mombasa, he was met with suspicion and hostility. He responded with cannon fire. He captured and tortured local pilots to force them to guide him. He saw every Muslim as an enemy, every interaction as a potential betrayal. In the port of Malindi, he finally found a skilled pilot, the legendary Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, who, according to some tales, was tricked or coerced into guiding the Portuguese across the Indian Ocean. In May 1498, after a journey of 10 months, Vasco da Gama's battered fleet dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut, the heart of the spice trade in India. But his arrival was not met with awe. The Zamarin, the Hindu ruler of Calicut, was unimpressed. The gifts da Gama brought coarse cloth, wash basins, hats, were laughable to a court accustomed to trading in gold, silver, and the finest silks. The Arab merchants who controlled the trade in the city immediately recognized the Portuguese for what they were, not traders, but they worked to poison the Zamorin against these crude, violent newcomers. The negotiations were a disaster. Da Gama, with his crusader mentality, was diplomatically inept. He was paranoid, arrogant, and quick to anger. After weeks of tense, fruitless meetings, he barely managed to acquire a small token cargo of spices. Fearing he would be trapped, Da Gama made a run for it. But before he left, he committed an act of casual brutality that would define the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean for the next century. He seized a number of Hindu fishermen and nobles as hostages to ensure his own safe departure. He had arrived as a diplomat and was leaving as a kidnapper. The journey home was even more horrific than the journey out. The monsoon winds were against them. It took them 3 months. Scurvy returned with a vengeance. So many men died that he did not have enough crew left to sail all his ships. He was forced to abandon and burn one of his vessels, the Sado Rafael, by the time Vasco da Gama limped back into Lisbon in the summer of 1499. 2 years after he had departed, he had lost 2 of his 4 ships and more than half of his men. By any normal measure, the voyage was a catastrophe. But he had brought back 2 things that outweighed all the death and suffering. First, the small cargo of spices he had managed to secure was so valuable that it paid for the entire cost of the expedition many times over. It was proof of the unimaginable profits that awaited. And second, he brought back knowledge not just of the route, but of the political and military situation in the Indian Ocean. He reported to King Manuel that the region was rich. The lesson was clear. Trade would not be won through diplomacy, but through the mouths of cannons. Portugal's path was set. It would not be a trading partner in the Indian Ocean. It would be its conqueror. Da Gama's return was celebrated as a national triumph. The dead were forgotten. The brutality was reframed as righteous strength. The tiny, desperate nation on the edge of Europe had kicked in the back door to a new, much larger, and more heavily armed fleet was dispatched immediately, followed by another and another. They came not to trade, but to dominate. Under commanders like Afonso de Albuquerque, they used a calculated policy of extreme terror. They seized key ports like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. They bombarded cities that resisted. They systematically hunted. One of the most infamous examples of this brutality occurred during Da Gama's second voyage in 1502. He intercepted a pilgrim ship named the Miri, which was returning from Mecca with hundreds of passengers, including women and children. After looting the ship, Da Gama ordered it to be set on fire. He locked all the passengers in the hold and burned them alive. It was an act of pure psychopathic. This was the reality of how the age of exploration was won. Not with better maps or braver sailors, but with a level of organized violence and ruthless efficiency the world had never seen. The Portuguese Empire was an empire of choke points, a maritime network of fortified trading posts that allowed a small number of men and ships to control the arteries of global trade. They had done the impossible. The forgotten. It was a stunning achievement born from a unique combination of desperation, religious fanaticism, technological advantage, and a cold, calculated willingness to use overwhelming force. It all began in the mind of a lonely prince on a desolate cliff, a man obsessed with the demons and treasures that lay beyond the edge of the known world. His obsession became a national crusade. That crusade, fueled by the profits of the slave trade, shattered the psychological barriers of fear and superstition. It led a lost captain around the Cape of Storms and unleashed a ruthless conquistador on the ancient trade routes of the East. Portugal's rise was meteoric, violent, and world-changing. It was a gamble against impossible odds, a deal made with the Sea of Darkness. And for a brief, glittering century, Portugal held the world in its hands. It was an empire built on a foundation of courage and cruelty, of scientific genius and unspeakable greed. It is a story that reminds us that history is not a clean, heroic epic, but a messy, brutal, and often terrifying tale of human ambition in all its glory and all its horror. That is all for today. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of the age of exploration, please subscribe, like, and support us. Your support helps us uncover more of the forgotten stories hidden in the shadows of history. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.